All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the 23rd annual Klement Lecture, which is a prime event here at the History Department each year. This lecture is named in honor of Frank L. Klement, who was a very distinguished professor in the History Department for 27 years at Marquette. He was the chair of the department. He won in 1965 the Distinguished Teacher Award. He also was the president of Phi Alpha Theta, the International History Honor Society, and he was the president of the Lincoln Foundation of Wisconsin. Originally, the Klement Lecture always dealt with the topic of the Civil War era, topics on the Civil War era. But in recent years, we've opened it up to include scholars of American history in other fields and on other subjects. And tonight is an example of this. I first met Frank Castiglione in 1996 when I applied for the MA program at the University of Rhode Island. I'd been out of academics for quite a while and had a lot of kind of misadventures and different jobs, including higher ed window washing, before I returned to the academy. And I grew up in an Irish-Italian neighborhood, and to be frank with you, I thought the whole world was Irish and Italian in Providence, Rhode Island. I didn't think there was anybody else. So when I was going through the class offerings, the course offerings, and I saw Frank's name, I said, I got to take a course with this guy. He's a paisan. So, you know, we have a wonderful tradition in Rhode Island. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Irish and Italian politicians, they work on legislation together, they get indicted together, and they go to prison together. And it's really a beautiful thing when you consider that these two ethnic groups that used to be so antagonistic towards one another can cooperate in this fashion. It was in that spirit that I asked Frank to be my MA advisor. Fortunately, the collaboration has been more fruitful or more positive than the previous examples I gave you. I also want to say that Frank was instrumental in my admission to the PhD program at the University of Connecticut after I finished my MA studies with him. He wrote a strong letter for me to Professor Tom Patterson, who's one of the luminaries in the field of foreign relations, one of the top 3 or 4 scholars in that era. And that helped a lot for me to get in there. And that program, the very strong program in foreign policy at Connecticut, is now the policy that Frank is now the position that Frank holds now, because Dr. Patterson unfortunately had a macrodegeneration of his eyes and he had to retire prematurely. And Frank applied for that position and got that position. In any capacity I could, as a graduate student there, of course, I tried to rig the process in favor of Frank's candidacy in the Rhode Island tradition. This included, throwing away other applications in the dumpster. Just kidding. I didn't go that far. But we have a joke in Rhode Island that says, "What do you call an Italian who fixes poker games?" Rigatoni. And for that week, I was Rigger Mike for the week that Frank applied to become the professor of foreign relations history at the University of Connecticut. What impressed me about Frank from the very first class I was in and his publications that I read was his incredible originality and his pluralistic approach to foreign policy. Besides state-to-state relations and the more traditional diplomacy, Frank incorporates psychology, literary analysis, gender, personality, emotion, race, a number of broad scope of methodologies to his studies and to his work, which I think makes him one of the top foreign policy and foreign relations professors in America today. And it made such an impression on me that the first couple of weeks in class, I went back to talk to my father about this. My dad quit school when he was 17 to join the U.S. military during World War II. He was a firefighter for 30 years in Providence. And I said to him, Dad, this guy Frank is really something. I said, he went to Cornell University. My father said, oh yeah, that's where they make the toothpaste. I said, no, Dad, that's Colgate University. But Frank, in fact, did receive his PhD at Cornell University, studying under Walter Lefebvre, who is the dean of scholars of U.S. foreign relations policy, foreign policy and foreign relations. And of course, Lefebvre was the student of William Appleman Williams at Madison, at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So there is this Wisconsin connection in Frank's work. And also his lovely wife, Diane, is a native of Milwaukee. Now I want to talk a little bit about Frank's publications, and then we'll get to the main reason why we're here, is listen to his talk. His first monograph was Awkward Dominion, American Political, Economic, and Cultural Relations with Europe, 1919 to 1933. To this day, it's the best book on the interwar period, on the U.S. diplomacy of the interwar period. And what Frank did is he used in his analysis a lot of popular culture, the huge influence that American culture had in Europe in the interwar years, besides doing an economic and political analysis of those relations. This book is still used in graduate courses to this day. It was published in 1984, and sections of it are in a number of readers and edited volumes as well. You know, just an outstanding work. Frank's next book was France and the United States, the Cold Alliance since the Second World War. And this looked at, which he took gender analysis, and he did really a very creative job of showing how U.S. officials feminized France and the American public to some extent, versus the more, as being a sort of troublesome and at times frigid woman, versus the more manly Germany, the more manly United Kingdom, et cetera, in the way that it viewed France. It was one of the first major books that really used gender in a strong way, in a central way, to look at U.S. foreign relations. His recent book, which I think is his masterwork, is of course Roosevelt's Lost Alliances, how personal politics helped start the Cold War, that was published in 2012. This book, I think, is incredibly creative in the way that it looks at a very old question, you know, what caused the Cold War, in which he uses psychology, personality, sexuality, and there's even a lot of references in the book to, you know, the sexuality and the interaction of the big three, which is kind of a scary thought when you think about it. Actually, there's one image that anybody who reads the book never forgets, and that's of Churchill stepping naked out of the tub and walking towards FDR at his home in Hyde Park, talking to him about the Mediterranean strategy they should employ against the Germans. We'll leave that there without any further. Frank's recent work, highly acclaimed editing of the Kennan Diaries, which is going to play a big role in what he talks about here tonight. But Frank has also been an editor of a couple of really important volumes for students, graduate students particularly, of American foreign relations. And those include he's coming out with a new version of a classic, which is going to be explaining the history of U.S. foreign relations, which he's going to edit, and he has a contribution to it as well. Also, his other book that I think is very important for students of that period is America in the World, the historiography of American foreign relations since 1941, which he's edited with Michael Hogan. And a number of really path-breaking articles as well. They're too numerous really here to list. But he does have a piece coming out in the Journal of American History in the spring on Kennan and Russia that is related to an expansion of his research that derived from the diaries. And so without further ado, I'd like to present the man who I really feel is the finest historian of American foreign relations today, working in the United States today, and that's Frank Castiglione.
Thank you, Michael. You know, Michael's always great sense of humor, so I mean, you have to take a lot of that with a grain of salt. But I do appreciate it, Michael. And you know, I think that in order for both of us to stay out of prison, we shouldn't talk too much about the circumstances by which I was hired at Connecticut. I mean, threatening people where other candidates' children crossed the street is, you know, we know that was pushing a little bit, but it was in a good cause. But I do appreciate it. So I want to thank you, Mike. I also want to thank Jim Martin, for the chair of the history department here, for helping to make this talk possible. I also want to thank Ed Ehrlich, an attorney and an amateur historian who was incredibly diligent and creative in digging up some of the images we're going to be seeing in my presentation today. I feel really humbled, genuinely humbled, and honored to be presenting the Frank Klement Lecture. This is, you know, Klement was an extraordinary professor here at Marquette. And I also I know that the topic of the talk is expanded somewhat away from Civil War, but I feel a little nervous about the fact that my talk is not about the Civil War, but there are some connections to the Civil War I want to point out. First of all, and also connections to Klement. I'm going to be talking about George Kennan, who is really a contemporary of Klement. Klement was born in Wisconsin in 1908. Kennan was also born in Wisconsin in 1904. So there you go, there's a connection right there. Another connection is that, also the Civil War, is that Kennan's father, Kossuth Kent Kennan, was born in 1851 and always considered himself to be kind of a member of the Civil War generation and sang soldier songs and was really kind of imbued with that kind of Civil War mentality, even though he was a little young compared to the soldiers. And finally, the last book that Kennan wrote, he wrote 20 books. George Kennan wrote 20 books, won numerous prizes for those books. But the last book he wrote, it published when he was 96 years old, called An American Family, and it deals with the Kennan family at the time of the Civil War. So there's good reason for me to be giving this lecture today, although I am very honored to be doing it. Okay. And so the title of the talk, we should actually have it up there, but the title of the talk is From Cambridge Avenue, here in Milwaukee, to Containment, the story of George F. Kennan in Milwaukee. Although a full decade has passed since the death of George F. Kennan, who died in 2005, discussion of his policy of containment continues. Whether Americans are debating how to deal with the potentially nuclear Iran, Putin's Russia, an assertive China, or ISIS, the recurring question is how? How should the United States respond to the perceived threat? Should Washington try to contain the adversary by blocking its expansion, building alliances around it, engaging in covert actions, and waiting for this threat to moderate, as Kennan advocated at the dawn of the Cold War with regard to the Soviet Union? Or should the United States pursue a more aggressive course by going to war and aiming for quick regime change? The two alternatives reflect differences over the efficacy of American military force and over faith in whether the United States can impose its institutions and values on other nations. Kennan was skeptical about going to war, and he doubted that the United States could remake Russia or any other nation in its image. In 1946-47, Kennan theorized containment as part of an overall foreign policy strategy, what is sometimes called grand strategy. The aura of Kennan and his thinking is such that even today, foreign policy experts talk about trying to find a new Kennan, someone who could articulate a workable grand strategy for the 21st century. I had a personal experience with this quest for the Holy Grail of a new Kennan. After I gave a talk at the U.S. State Department this past July, someone asked me if I had some extra time to talk with the policy planning staff, the group charged with planning long-term U.S. foreign policy. Kennan was the first director of that policy planning staff in 1947. There's the picture of Kennan with the policy planning staff in 1947. He's at the head of the table there. So they asked me if I'd be willing to go up to the policy planning staff, the current one, and meet, which is on the 7th floor where Kerry has his office and all that, and talk to them about what George Kennan might say about this or that. So I said sure. I certainly was happy to do that. And so I went up to the 7th floor and was grilled by the assembled policy planning staff, including his director, on what George Kennan would say or do about this or that problem. I tried to do my best, but I really don't think I really channeled George Kennan. But that shows you the kind of still the faith in George Kennan as the brilliant architect of American foreign policy, a highly rational strategist who advocated realism, cautious realism in dealings with other nations. Let us now, on the other hand, consider a different view of Kennan. In 1958, after watching a London performance of Anton Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, Kennan confided in his diary that the play stirred up my Russian self, which is much more genuine than the American one. And having all this prodded to the surface in me, I sat there blubbering like a child and trying desperately to keep the rest of the company from noticing it. Here was the author of The Containment Doctrine, America's lodestar in the Cold War with Russia, feeling that his Russian self was actually much more genuine than the American one. Here, moreover, was the advocate of reason in foreign relations, struggling to hide his own very intense feelings. The Oxford political theorist Isaiah Berlin, a lifelong friend of Kennan, observed that all of Kennan's ideas, actions, and feelings spring from his from his inner personality. That's why he needs a psychological approach, not just a conventional political or historical analysis. While my approach is far too eclectic to qualify as a formal psychological approach, I do agree with Berlin that we cannot understand Kennan's life or his foreign policy recommendations without looking at his emotions and his other psychological factors. So I will attempt this evening a kind of, not a psychological analysis of Kennan, but rather a look at some of the underlying early influences that shaped his personality and his outlook on life. Of lasting impact were his early years growing up in Milwaukee. His personality was affected not by the fact that he lived in Milwaukee, but rather by what happened during his Milwaukee years, which is from when he was born on February 16th, 1904, to when he was sent off to St. John's Military Academy in Delafield in 1916 when he was 12. The peculiar circumstances of his family life in Milwaukee seems to have imbued Kennan with an enduring sense of loneliness and melancholy. He was someone who throughout his 101-year life longed for belonging and community. He developed a powerful imagination to deal with his unhappiness. Unhappy with much about his own life, both when he was a child and when he was an adult, Kennan was heartened by belief that the world did contain the potential for wondrous mystery and ultimate satisfaction. He just had to find it. He would come to see traditional Russia as a place where he might satisfy the cravings and longings that had been gnawing at him since he was a young child in Milwaukee. At the start of his memoir, which he published in 1967, Kennan explains that he was, quote, scarred for life by the death of his mother in April 1904, just 2 months after he was born. And here's a photo, should be, of his mother, Florence James Kennan, who died just 2 months after George was born. In his first interview with his authorized biographer, John Gaddis, Kennan changed topics, cut Gaddis off to volunteer that he was, quote, neurotically affected by the loss of his mother. While growing up, George believed erroneously that his mother had died from complications of giving birth to him. That was not true. She had died from unrelated causes, the bursting of her appendix, weeks later. But he was weighed down by that guilt, along with the loneliness of missing his mother. Other aspects of his family life aggravated the loss. Now that's a picture of George Kennan with his family. He has 3 older sisters. There's George in the back there when he's about probably 15 or 16. 3 older sisters, his father's in the lower kind of middle left, his stepmother, and his half-brother Kent. He did have 3 loving older sisters, but his father, Kossuth Kent Kennan, whom everybody called Kent, I'll call Kent from here on in, already 52 years old when George was born, remained a shy, awkward man who feared that showing outward affection would prevent his son from growing up manly. It is significant that no one in the family thought to explain to George the real reason why his mother had died, and that George did not feel comfortable enough to share his guilt feelings with his father, sisters, or other relatives. And he might have been assured that he didn't cause his mother's death years before he found that out. One older sister later recalled that not only had George been weaned abruptly, but he was also suddenly deprived of the actual holding the body, the body contact with his mother. Kent Kennan at first hired one or more nurses to care for the children. The nurses evidently each wore a white uniform, and they made a lasting impression. Even years later, the adult Kennan admitted that he was extraordinarily attracted to almost any woman dressed in a white uniform. Then the father, a year or so later, invited a 28-year-old cousin of his deceased wife to become a live-in caregiver for the children. An older sister remembered that this cousin Grace was wonderful. She adored George. He was her baby. George would later name his first child after cousin Grace, visit her while he was in college at Princeton, and help support her financially in her old age. George would tell his daughter that his very first memory, and I think this is significant, his very first memory was asking, why do we call cousin Grace mother? But this mother figure was also suddenly torn away. When George was 4, his father married Louise Wheeler, a woman whom George would remember as really cruel. Born in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Louise taught Latin and Greek at Ripon College, where Kent was an alumnus and had gone there for an alumni affair and met her. The children all cried, as did Cousin Grace, when she suddenly had to move out, and Louise moved in. This was quite a trauma for us, a sister recalled. The Kennan children nicknamed their mother the kangaroo from Kalamazoo. One of her sisters later recalled that Louise wasn't especially motherly. She was a club woman, a bright woman, but as the mother of 4 little children, she wasn't the perfect choice. Louise Wheeler Kennan was indeed an intelligent, sociable woman. She had taught, as I mentioned, at Ripon College, and she had served as president of the local chapter of the American Association of University Women. And here, you won't be able to see this, you'll have to take my word for it, but here is the Milwaukee Social Register, and if you look close, you can see the number of clubs she belonged to, including the AAUW, where she had been president. But despite her many activities, or partly because of her many activities, she never grew close with young George. As a toddler, George had a practice of bumping his head on the floor and starting to cry until his sisters rushed up to comfort him. We will return in a few minutes to the lasting implications of George's complaint as an adult, quote, "I never had a mother." Kennan's early years were also affected by the social and economic hierarchy of early 20th century Milwaukee. Although Kent Kennan had done a variety of things in his life, he had spent time out west, and he had worked for 2 years in Switzerland, helping recruit settlers to settle along the land owned by the Wisconsin Central Railroad. He had never made a lot of money. He was a tax lawyer before that was a profession which guaranteed you a very large income. Indeed, the scholarly Kent had studied the income tax as a system of taxation in Germany and had studied in other countries, had written a book on the subject and advised the state of Wisconsin on establishing an income tax. I guess your current governor would not be a fan of Kent Kennan. This shows the building where it's actually, that's on Wisconsin Avenue, but it's the Wells building where Kent worked. But Kent, decades older than George's mother, Florence James, never won the approval of the James family. They were far wealthier. The Jameses were far wealthier and constituted Milwaukee high society. Alfred James, Florence's father, and his son, Alfred James Jr., were each in their time president of the Northwestern National Insurance Company. As a boy, the elder Alfred had run away to sea, had seen much of the world, had later developed gold mines in the West, and had amassed a considerable fortune. The Jameses tried to discourage Florence from marrying Kent. He lacked sufficient money, family standing, and charm, and plus he was far older than their daughter. They insisted, but she insisted on marrying him. Alfred complained that while Kent Kennan is a very good lawyer, he is a very poor businessman. Even after the marriage of Florence and Kent, and even after Florence's death, the Jameses' prejudices against Kent was always there, one of George's sisters later recalled. That the disapproval was so palpable that his daughters, Kent's daughters, could notice it must have been humiliating for Kent Kennan. He once exclaimed about his in-laws and about decisions regarding his children, "I just wish they'd let me judge for myself." Underscoring Kent's inequality with the Jameses was the fact that they had paid for the house that he lived in with Florence and his children, and later with his wife after Florence died. Furthermore, Kent for many years used for living expenses, family living expenses, the income from the rather large trust that the Jameses had set up for each of his children, each of the 4 children that Florence and Kent had had. Such dependence on his children's money may have contributed to Kent's difficulty in relaxing with them, and especially relaxing with his son George. The sisters later recalled that after dinner, rather than conversing or playing games together, each member of the family would retreat to his or her room to read or write letters or whatever. As one sister summed it up, quote, "I don't think the Kennan family were very happy people." Even the Kennan house, on what was then 953 Cambridge Avenue, was a gloomy place. George later remembered it as a dark, strange household. All the windows of the living room faced up right against another house. and the windowless side faced toward an open lawn. So it was a rather dark house. And here's a picture of, so this is across the street. On the right is across the street from where the Kennan's house was. But it gives you an idea of what the house probably looked like. This lovely thing here on the left is on the site of where the Kennan house stood. So we can move on from that. We don't have to look at that too long. Here's George at age 7. Years later, Jeanette Kennan, who was 2 years older than George, remembered a conversation when she was 9 and her brother was 7. George: a person wouldn't have to live if he didn't want to, wouldn't he? He could kill himself. Jeanette: but that wouldn't be nice at all. Why would you want to do that? George: well, you could shoot yourself or maybe drown yourself in the lake. But yet, not all was doom and gloom. The next-door neighbors, the Frosts, were a childless couple who adored the Kennan children and encouraged them to play in their backyard. George's middle name, Frost, reflected the fact that the two families were close. George also spent much time with his cousins, the Jameses. The James family owned a compound on Lake Nagawiki, including a house that the 4 Kennan children had inherited from their mother. This is where George, his sisters, and their cousins spent many of their summers, having a good time. It's also where George developed a lifelong love of sailing, and indeed years later he named his beloved sailboat the Nagawiki. One aspect of early 20th century Milwaukee that did have a direct causal impact on George Kennan was the excellent public school he attended. Milwaukee State Normal, a grade school used to train teachers. Today the building is Mitchell Hall on the UWM campus. The school was 2 miles away from the Kennan home. George would either walk or travel back and forth by streetcar, a mode of transportation he found thrilling. The school emphasized grammar, especially the diagramming of sentences, which may help account for George's extraordinary ability as an adult to dictate or write complex yet elegant sentences. In the first grade, he started the study of German, and he later was able to speak that language as a native with no accent, as he could Russian. Especially talented was his 4th grade teacher, Miss Emily Strong. His sister commented that Miss Strong looked like and excessively admired Theodore Roosevelt. Another famous graduate of Milwaukee State Normal was Douglas MacArthur, although he was older than George. And a teacher whom George never had was the future Israeli premier Golda Meir. On January 1st, 1916, George, then 11 years old, picture of him there, began keeping a diary. Just 2 diary entries here. March 23rd, 1916, woke up this morning to see about 20 inches of snow. I worked for an hour before breakfast shoveling snow and going out for bread. After breakfast, Jeanette and I spent nearly an hour walking to school on the streetcar tracks, as the cars weren't running then, and the tracks were the only place where walking was possible. Evidently, school was not canceled. April 23rd. Today was Easter and Charlie James's birthday. That's his cousin. After Sunday school, I went to his house and saw his presents. He got $11, and it's all in capital letters, $11 from his father. The diary ends a few weeks later. That fall, Kent decided to send George to St. John's Military Academy. Perhaps a strange choice, because as one of the sisters recalled, St. John's had a reputation as a place where you sent difficult to discipline, recalcitrant boys, which George was not. It may be that his stepmother, Louise, who did find it difficult getting along with George, pressured Kent to send George to military school. Another reason may also have been that Kent felt that it was not be manly for George to grow up in a household with everybody else in the household was a woman. So here's a picture of George as a cadet. Still another family tie of George Kennan proved disappointing. He had been named after another George Kennan, a cousin of his grandfather who lived from 1845 to 1924, another George Kennan who did not have Frost as a middle name. This elder Kennan had gained fame, nationwide fame, for his travels across Tsarist Russia and his publicizing information about the grim penal system in Siberia. He gave hundreds of lectures throughout the United States, wrote many articles and several books on Russia. He was one of the main American experts on Russia, consulted by presidents and so forth. There would be many parallels in the lives of the two George Kennans. They were born on the same day, February 16th. Both liked playing the guitar, both liked sailing and similar kinds of boats. They both had offices in the same office in the Smithsonian in Washington. Both would be expelled from Russia, and so forth. On their common birthday, the elder Kennan would send his namesake a present. Young George, whose own father remained emotionally distant, looked to this famous relative as a role model. But the relationship was poisoned by the hostility of the wife of the elder George Kennan, whose own child, named George, had died as an infant. And she was probably jealous of this younger George. She insisted that the younger cousin George was not worthy of being taken seriously by her famous husband. So she intervened and helped just kind of limit or finally end that contact. So here was another potentially intimate tie that was snatched away from the sensitive boy. George sought refuge from his loneliness in fantasy. On the first page of his memoir, he describes himself as a child dreaming daydreams so intense and satisfying that hours could pass in oblivion of immediate surroundings. Moreover, he lived, he said, especially in childhood, but also in later years, in a world that was peculiarly and intimately my own. I habitually read special meanings into things, scenes, and places, qualities of wonder, beauty, promise, or horror for which there was no external evidence, visible or plausible to others. One of his beliefs, which he talked about, one of his beliefs that he wrote about in his memoirs, is that he believed for sure that in the trees in Juneau Park, here in Milwaukee, there lived fairies. Not among the trees, but in the trees. This ability to imagine, and this belief that his senses reached beyond the ordinary, remained the constant in George's life and would affect his reactions to Russia and other matters. Even as a serious diplomat, he recalled, every city that I went to had not only a different atmosphere, but a different sort of music and intonation to it. I was immensely sensitive and responsive to differences in the atmosphere of places. Years after being a child, when he was in his 60s, writing that memoir published in 1967, Kennan wrote something interesting, I think, about those fairies in Juneau Park. He said, certainly, he said, and he's writing this in the mid-60s, he said, certainly the automobiles and other ravages have killed off any fairies that might have lived in Juneau Park in 1910. But who's to say, he writes, that in 1910 there were not indeed fairies living in Juneau Park. Things are as we see them. Fairies were a part of this view of mine. To what extent they had their actual existence in the park, and to what extent just in me, we shall never know. He then commented, I think significantly, that perhaps a long and intensive self-analysis along Freudian lines would clarify such questions about the fairies. Kennan believed in and practiced self-analysis along Freudian lines. He regarded psychoanalytic theory as a scientific truth. This belief is not surprising. Kennan came of intellectual age in the 1920s and 30s, when American and European public discourses were awash with Freudian interpretations promising optimistic therapy, relaxed sexual inhibitions, and access to the unconscious. Kennan spent the first half of 1935 in a Viennese sanitarium, recovering from what his Freudian-minded medical doctor diagnosed as severe physical and nervous strain after service in Russia. Years later, Kennan still believed, that as he wrote his doctor, that his health depended primarily on psychic rather than on physical conditions. In the 1950s through 70s, Kennan read and was convinced by the Freudian-inspired psychobiographies done of Martin Luther, Woodrow Wilson, Henry James, and others. In the 1980s, he urged Gaddis, his authorized biographer, to include a psychological analysis in the biography, something that Gaddis shied away from. Let me emphasize something here, and that is why I do not myself subscribe to Freudian theory. I do believe that understanding Kennan requires us to take into account the importance of Freudian notions in how Kennan saw himself. Kennan emphasized two such Freudian notions. The first was the lasting influence of infantile sexual desire. In his case, he believed such desire was complicated by the loss of his mother. His not having had a mother had made him twisted, he wrote, when he was a Princeton undergraduate. And that's Kennan with a borrowed car as a Princeton undergraduate. And here's another one of him about that time. Passport photo when he was 20 years old. We can recall in this connection his father hiring nurses to care for him after his mother's death, and the adult Kennan's commenting on his lifelong erotic attraction to almost any woman he saw dressed in a white uniform. In fact, in his this diary entry when he's about 80 years old and he's just come back from the dentist, and he says, why did they have to hire such attractive dental hygienists? George's lost mother, Florence, forever beautiful, loving, and beyond reach, flitted through his thoughts in his diary throughout his life. She enticed him in a dream, younger than I had thought of her as being, with intense eyes and a sensitive, sometimes slightly pouting mouth. She seemed a real human being, not the angel I had always pictured. In another dream, he was searching for his mother in a crowd of Russian peasants. As a diplomat in Moscow and as a foreign policy strategist in Washington, Kennan projected some of these yearnings for an eroticized mother figure onto traditional Russia. He saw the land and the people, though certainly not the government of Russia, as appealingly feminine in ways both maternal and erotic. The scenario that he referred to many times was that he, the Russian people, and the Soviet leadership were locked in a tragic triangle in which he figured as the rightful partner of the Russian people. The Russian people were like a beautiful lady guarded by a jealous lover in the Kremlin. Kennan, in his diplomatic writings and other kinds of in speeches and so forth, would rhapsodize about the powerful maternal thighs of the female Slav. Even as a dignified ambassador, and this is in a cable he wrote to Washington, even as a dignified ambassador, he could not refrain from celebrating the great good earth of Mother Russia, exuding her benevolent and maternal warmth over all. Nor could he ignore the pain that only he, the American ambassador, flanked by his and guarded by his secret police minders, only he was effectively isolated from the maternal warmth of that mother. The second Freudian principle that Kennan took to heart was elaborated by Freud in his book, Civilization and Its Discontents. Reading that book and other works by Freud convinced Kennan that at the center of our psychic construction is a libido, the demands of which, as Freud has demonstrated, we ignore at our peril. Warring with the instinct to reproduce, in other words, a sexual urge, with the taboos and penalties of civilization. If a man, and Kennan nearly always took the male gender as normative, if a man were caught between the cogs of nature and those of society, he would be rubbed to pieces. More than sexual freedom was at stake, however. Kennan regarded the libido as the control switch for vitality and intellectual and aesthetic creativity. While inciting chaos, the erotic force also enabled escape from the deadly boredom of everyday life. Kennan feared that by upholding the laws of society, in particular his duties as a husband, a father, and an official, he was being forced into a renunciation of his own vitality. A key point for our understanding of Kennan, then, is that he was intrigued. He was intrigued by the notion that by immersing himself somehow in Russia, he might find the erotic maternal presence that he craved, while also escaping the eros versus civilization dilemma that he dreaded. Kennan finally got to Russia in late 1933, when the new ambassador invited him to help set up the American embassy in Moscow. And this is the first American embassy since the Russian Revolution happened in 1933. Here's Kennan, and there he is as the young diplomat. The offer rescued the junior diplomat from a psychological and a professional dead end. Although Kennan in later years would disparage Marxist theory, in 1932, he put forth a Marxian explanation for both the Great Depression, the economic Great Depression of the 30s, and his personal depression. And he compared the two. What had struck, he wrote, was not a crisis, but the crisis. Just as in the past, capitalism had always found new markets to absorb the flood of economic expansion, so too had his psyche always been buoyed by new illusions and new hopes to absorb energy and attention. That is all changing now. The world is at the end of its economic rope. I am at the end of my mental rope. Bullitt's sudden offer to come to Moscow with him followed the State Department's rejection of Kennan's request to visit Russia on his own. Kennan had despaired before Bullitt invited him. Kennan had despaired that Russia is, to me, a forbidden world, and the irony of this realization has struck so deep that I am becoming indifferent to it, as we become indifferent to all things which we really know we cannot have. Something else forbidden to him in the months before his going to Moscow was peace from the conflict between obligation and libido, between his marriage and his personal pride and spirit. Although he loved and would remain married to his Norwegian-born wife, Annalise Sorensen Kennan, for 73 years, he had several affairs, and as he wrote in his diary, he longed to have more, despite the always ensuing guilt. Bullitt's invitation offered relief from these dilemmas, as well as a chance to advance his career and engage with the object of his fascination. He imagined Russia, despite its profound problems, as a kind of wonderland. There he might satisfy his longings to be comforted, to belong, and to transcend what he regarded as the iron dilemma of eros versus civilization. Kennan crossed the border from Poland into Russia with Bullitt on December 10, 1933. Too excited to sleep, I sat through the night, scratching the frost off the window pane, staring out at the crowds on the little station platforms. His first year in Moscow proved a time so intense that he could neither repeat it nor forget it. He wrote, life approached the true bohème. Parties were not given, they developed. I loved it. I felt at home with these people. Soviet officials were delighted by young Kennan, Bullitt reported. Kennan plunged into what he called the excitement and the dizziness of life in Moscow. His life overflowed with work, exercise, and debate into the early morning. While fascinating, it was also terribly strenuous. How long can I stand it, he wondered, yet he was too excited to slow down. Experiencing Moscow sharpened Kennan's critique of America. He admired the social activism and idealism of Russian intellectuals, artists, and younger Communist Party officials. He resented that his status as a U.S. official prevented him from actually participating in the building of a new society. Kennan contrasted what he called the stark reality of Soviet life with the neurotic unreality of American life. Soviet society glowed with something unmistakably healthy, not the health we strive for by the elimination of microbes and danger and physical hardship, but rather an earthy vitality bred by surviving the ruthless natural selection enforced by revolution and civil war. The revolution's rejection of bourgeois sexual norms promised release from the dilemmas of eros versus civilization. Insisting he had not gone Bolshevist, the amateur social theorist nonetheless proclaimed that the family must disappear as an ideal of human happiness. The principle of permanent and possessive intimacy must give way to something resembling, aside from sexual relationships, the attitude of college roommates to each other. Although Kennan remained vague about his own sexual activities, he could not have been indifferent to the sexual playground that was the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. His friend, the Foreign Service officer Charlie Thayer, later reminisced about the not entirely sane existence we had led with misses and mistresses all together in an alcoholic haze. And here's Kennan in 1935, actually in a very, family scene with his wife Annalise and their daughter Grace. The intensity of living in Moscow racked Kennan's body and mind. I was too fascinated by Russia, he would later admit. What Kennan termed his nervous strain mounted until December 12, 1934, which is exactly a year to the day after he arrived in Moscow. And on that day, he suffered a physical and mental collapse. He spent the first half of 1935 in a Viennese sanitarium under the medical care of a Freudian-minded doctor, and there he read Freud. He longed to escape, he wrote his sister, by mingling again with Russians. He also wrote his sister back in Milwaukee, I see no possibility of ever adapting myself to our type of society again. Still protesting that he was no Bolshevik, he lauded, he praised some of the visions of the more intelligent communist leaders as the most impelling and inspiring human conceptions ever devised. The dictator Joseph Stalin's destruction of most of those inspirational figures in the massive purges that began in 1935 would poison Kennan's perspective on the Kremlin's domestic and foreign policies. Nearly all of Kennan's friends, Russian friends, would perish, and the resulting xenophobic frenzy ensured that survivors avoided contact with foreigners such as Kennan. Stalin's terror traumatized Kennan and his diplomatic colleagues. I even dream of friends being arrested, Kennan admitted. He sat in the gallery every day, attending the grotesque show trial of Karl Radek, a hero of the revolution and a friend of Kennan. Isaiah Berlin remembered that Kennan was terribly absorbed, personally involved somehow in the terrible nature of Stalin's regime. Decades later, Kennan would still feel the purges as hammer blow impressions, each more outrageous and heart-rending than the other. The effect was never to leave me. Its imprint on my political judgment was lasting. That's a direct quote. Here, in a much lighter tone, of course, when people take pictures, is George and Annalise Kennan in 1937 at a costume party in Moscow. Though disappointed and embittered, Kennan still longed to shepherd somehow, and this is really the most amazing part of the story, I think. He still longed to shepherd somehow a coming together through him of Russia and America. He wanted to think that somewhere in that Russian world, in the freshness and spontaneity of its human relationships, in his childishly blunt reaction to the problems of civilization, in the unfathomable warmth and beauty of its language, things could be found which would help in solving the problems of American culture. His aspiration was at once a fantasy that would never come about, and also a foretelling that would indeed come about, but in an inverted and dangerous way by means of the Cold War. In 1937, shortly after this photograph was made, Kennan was transferred out of Moscow, in part because his superiors feared that in Russia he was going off the deep end. But let's backtrack to the previous quotation. What did Kennan mean when he referred to solving the problems of American culture by looking to the freshness, the warmth, and the community of traditional Russian culture? Kennan liked to compare life in Russia, living with the Russians in Russia, to spending a cold winter night sleeping with a whole group of people under a huge blanket. There'd always be bugs and smells, but it was also warm and cozy. It was that warmth and coziness that the young George had missed so terribly when he was living in that austere house on Cambridge Avenue with family members who rushed off to their own rooms after dinner. After leaving Russia in August 1937, Kennan was transferred to the State Department in Washington. In June 1938, he spent several days bicycling by himself through central Wisconsin, around the village of Endeavor, to visit the farm where his grandfather had homesteaded after the Civil War. Kennan came away from this trip thinking that the individualism of Americans in 1938 was much like the isolationism that he had experienced on Cambridge Avenue. I want to read a bit from that diary entry from 1938 because it illustrates Kennan's beautiful writing style, and also because because I want to point up his analysis of what he saw as a problem, what he defined as a problem, and his solution to that problem. Because what he saw as a problem and what he defined as a solution tells us a lot about Kennan's personality and also about his approach to what several years later would become the Cold War. So here's Kennan shortly after that bicycle trip. He's writing now again about central Wisconsin. These beautiful highways were the most deserted places I had ever encountered. In the course of a 100-mile journey, I was destined to see on the open road no single fellow cyclist, no single pedestrian, no single horse-drawn vehicle. To those of us who inhabited the highway, to the birds and insects and snakes and turtles and chipmunks and the lone cyclist, me, the occasional auto car was only an abstract danger, a natural menace like lightning, earthquake, or flood, which had to be reckoned with and coped with. And then he writes, here the turtles, whose corpses strewed the pavement for miles, seemed to be at the greatest disadvantage. And when I read that, I thought that's something we don't see anymore. Evidently, I mean, you think about the coming of the automobile to the United States must have killed off lots of turtles, because you don't see turtles among roadkills, not very often, right? Other things. In any case, he pointed out lots of turtles strewn the pavement for miles. Okay. We had no human relationship with these automobiles, and they seemed to accentuate our loneliness. To anyone who complains of a lack of seclusion in our modern life, I recommend walking or cycling on the highways. He may go for days without meeting any other person. And then Kennan writes, when he's staying in a hotel near the roadside, he's looking out in the evening, and in the evening, each car had its couple or foursome inside, bent on pleasure in the form of a movie or a dance or a petting party. All the life of the evening flowed along the highways in this fashion, segregated into quiet groups of twos and fours. There was no provision for anyone else. There was no place where strangers would come together freely, as in a Bavarian beer hall or a Russian amusement park, for the mere purpose of being together and enjoying new acquaintances. Even the saloons were nearly empty. This was the sad climax of individualism, the blind alley of a generation which had forgotten to think or live collectively, of a people who felt neither curiosity nor responsibility for the mass of those who shared their community life and their community problems. And then Kennan went on, I recalled the truly wonderful fashion in which, as had so often proved in the past, these same people would rise to the occasion and subordinate their personal interests to collective efforts in the event of a natural catastrophe, such as a flood, a hurricane, or a war. And I could not help, and this is the key part, and I could not help but feel that one ought to welcome almost any social cataclysm, however painful and however costly, which would carry away some of this stuffy individualism and force human beings to seek their happiness and their salvation in their relationship to society as a whole, rather than in the individual. That such a cataclysm, he goes on, that such a cataclysm was imminent within the span of a decade or two seemed probable enough, and I found myself looking forward to it. And it's extraordinary. So here was Kennan welcoming the catastrophe, the cataclysm of a hot or a cold war or a natural disaster, because it would spur Americans into giving up, at least for a while, their selfish individualism and instead pull together, reach out to each other, and rebuild fellowship and community, as ordinary Russians did, or at least as Kennan idealized them as doing under that cozy blanket of Russian society. 8 years later, in 1946, when Kennan wrote his famous long telegram to the State Department urging containment of the Soviet Union, and in 1947, when Kennan again urged containment of the Kremlin in a widely read article published in the magazine Foreign Affairs, on both occasions, Kennan stressed that the rigors of confronting the Soviets would be good for American society, and he portrayed the reform of American society, particularly by Americans adopting less individualism, less selfish attitude toward common problems. He saw that as a major weapon in the Cold War and a major positive result of the Cold War. In fact, he argued that Americans could do much to limit Russia's aggression just by making the United States a more rational, a unified, and more collective country. Let me now, in the interest of time, encapsulate the 5 factors that, as I see it, impelled Kennan to write the 1946 long telegram advocating containment of the Soviet Union. The first of the 5 factors was his continuing resentment of Stalin and the secret police for limiting his contact with the Russian people. These restrictions seemed all the more painful after July 1944, when Kennan returned to Moscow as number 2 to the American ambassador Averell Harriman. So he'd been gone for 7 years, now he was back, and soaking in the Russian atmosphere. Kennan caught whiffs again of how it could all be very, very different. On one delightful afternoon, he wrote, on one delightful afternoon, he was stranded in a provincial airport with a plane load of Russian passengers. After he pulled out of his knapsack a biography of Peter the Great and began reading in Russian, the passengers all gathered around him and listened to him for hours. I felt at home with these people, he later recalled. On another occasion in Siberia, a government official treated him to a raucous night out on the town. Kennan's memory of this experience revealed his yearning to belong. For one lovely evening, I was to all intents and purposes, for one lovely evening, I mean, this is the guy who's supposedly so anti-Soviet. For one lovely evening, I was to all intents and purposes a member of the Soviet governing elite. Walking on the streets in Moscow, he breathed in what he described as the earthy, almost touching smells of the ordinary people. He experienced their tremendous pulsating warmth and vitality as an indescribable sensation. He wrote his sister back in Milwaukee that he would rather live in Siberia than to live in Milwaukee. I don't know, I guess take that, however. Also enticing him was the lure of transcendence. If only he could get deeper into Russia, he wrote, he might finally arrive face to face with that indefinable something so full of promise and meaning that I've always felt to be just around the corner. Such fulfillment, however, was denied him. The wartime alliance had not erased, it had eased, but had not erased the post-1934 restrictions on contact between Soviet citizens and foreigners such as Kennan. Forced isolation from the Russian people meant, he wrote, I will never be able to become a part of them. A second factor leading Kennan to advocate containment, also of very great importance, was Kennan's anger at the Red Army for raping and pillaging its way into Berlin, and his even greater anger at the Soviet government for imposing brutal domination over Poland and the other countries in Eastern Europe. As a Foreign Service officer, he saw Russian expansion into Eastern and Central Europe as a political challenge to the United States. And that's certainly very important. The third factor was his resentment against the US government. Kennan was enormously ambitious, and he had, if anything, too much pride in his abilities. He prided himself as the State Department's most knowledgeable expert on Eastern Europe. Yet he was passed over when Franklin Roosevelt assembled a team to advise him at the Yalta Conference with Stalin and Churchill in February 1945. That's something that rankled Kennan for the rest of his days. Kennan's complaint that his expertise was being wasted in far-off Moscow only deepened in the year after Yalta. He warned his friends in the State Department that unless the higher-ups gave him the responsibility and prestige he deserved, he was going to resign from the Foreign Service. Isaiah Berlin, who knew Kennan in Moscow during this time, late 45, early 46, recalled that his friend was boiling with moral indignation. I have another photo here. The fourth precipitating factor leading Kennan to write the long telegram was Stalin's so-called election speech of February 1946. The dictator, in trying to reshape memory of World War II in Russia, so as to highlight the role of the Communist Party in securing victory, downplayed the contributions of the Western Allies and even of the Red Army. This highly ideological speech worried Washington. The State Department asked Kennan to analyze the speech, and Kennan's friends prodded him that now was his golden chance to seize the opportunity to get the attention that he craved. The fifth and final factor leading Kennan to write the long telegram harked, of course, back to Milwaukee. back to something that Kennan regarded as so important that he mentioned it, something else he mentioned on page 1 of his memoir. When required to attend Bornique's dancing school on Saturday afternoons, he wrote, he would retire into sullen rages and sit-down strikes. He hated having to get all dressed up and go to those damn dancing classes on Saturday afternoons. He took his revenge in an interesting way. He took his revenge. If he couldn't go out and play Saturday afternoons, he took his revenge by also refusing to go out and play Saturday mornings. If he could not have the entire day free, he did not want any part of it free. Similarly, a few years later, he wrote, if vacation from military school was not warmed by understanding and sympathy, especially from some pretty girl, he would refuse to socialize at all. If denied warmth and inclusion, he would, he later recalled, deepen the deprivation, and thereby exact what he called his retribution. Let those responsible, this is all his writing, let those responsible feel his bitterness. He had his pride. They could bend it, but they could not break it. And let them pay for their folly in bending it. A martyr he was, and a martyr he should remain to the end of his days. And this is not just as a child. As a middle-aged man, he reaffirmed, if I cannot have all, or the greater part of what I want most desperately, no one is going to deprive me of the glorious martyrdom of having none of it at all. Rather proud of what he termed this neurosis, he noted that my father was much the same way. So among the diverse, and I grant diverse, among the diverse thoughts and impulses leading Kennan to urge containment of the Soviet Union, there was also, it appears, his habit of seeking retribution and martyrdom by widening the breach and deepening the pain. Containment meant many things. Among them was his saying, in effect, let those in the Kremlin who kept him from the people and culture he loved feel his bitterness and pay for their folly. If Kennan could not engage freely with Russians, he, and by extension the United States, would almost totally disengage from Russians. If the Soviet authorities wanted to cut him off, he would bring about an isolation more extreme than anyone imagined. Kennan urged Washington to contain the Kremlin, which had so cruelly contained him. His long telegram to the State Department would single out as the most disturbing feature of diplomacy in Moscow the foreigner's isolation from ordinary Russians and from Soviet policymakers whom one cannot see and cannot influence. Kennan's nearly 6,000-word long telegram invoked, in the name of realism, a fantastic scenario in which the Soviet Union appeared as an inhuman force, without morality, unable to appreciate objective fact or truth, and pathologically compelled to destroy almost every decent aspect of life in the West. After elaborating on this existential threat, Kennan, in his conclusion, tried to pull back. He reassured that the Soviet Union did not want war, differed from Nazi Germany, remained weaker than America, and could be contained without war if the United States and Western Europe instituted domestic reforms. Indeed, heading off talk about an inevitable war, which some people were talking about, was part of Kennan's motivation advocating the alternative of containment rather than war. Despite the assurances in the conclusion, it was Kennan's emotionalized depiction of the Soviet threat and his militarized language that rang bells in Washington. The Kremlin, Kennan wrote in the long telegram, was impervious to the logic of reason and highly sensitive to the logic of force. Not surprisingly, many U.S. officials concluded that containment mandated a military buildup. While painting this dark picture, Kennan held out the possibility of a brighter future. Containment could promote tendencies which must eventually find their outlet in either the breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power. Then, once again, contact with the Russian people would become possible. In view of Kennan's complaints about Americans' excessive individualism, like complaints that he had expressed, for instance, after his bike ride through Wisconsin, it is not surprising that he concluded both the long telegram and the Mr. X article with a call for domestic reform. Americans should welcome the Soviet challenge as a prod for pulling themselves together. In sum, Kennan's urging of containment reflected not only pushback against Soviet expansion, but also long-standing impulses and concerns, namely his desire for the Russian people, his resentment of Soviet repression, his propensity for self-punishment, his professional ambition, and his aspiration to reform U.S. society. And finally, his faith that American interaction with Russia, whether hostile or friendly, could spur needed domestic change. The long telegram secured the acclaim that Kennan had long coveted. The Truman administration gave him a hero's welcome back in Washington. In early 1947, Kennan was named the first director of the newly created policy planning staff. My voice now carried, he noted with great satisfaction. Here's a picture of Kennan at a State Department office. Kennan had long reached the center of power. He remained there, however, only about 2 years. While working on strategies to contain and isolate the Kremlin, he also found himself yearning to reestablish contact. As early as February 1948, only 6 months after the publication of the Mr. X article, Kennan, at time, February 48, when Washington was ramping up its Cold War efforts, Kennan, in February 48, actually advised the Secretary of State that now was the time for Kennan to be sent to Moscow and negotiate a deal with Stalin. The State Department didn't know what to make of that suggestion. By early 1949, Kennan was losing influence in Washington as his views increasingly diverged from those of the more militant Cold Warriors. In the 1950s, Kennan, now a private citizen, repeatedly proposed negotiations to ease the Cold War. In 1966, he became the first prominent former policymaker to come out against the Vietnam War. In televised Senate hearings held by Senator J. William Fulbright, and Kennan's testimony was really a sensation. He was the father of the containment doctrine, criticizing the so-called containment being practiced in the Vietnam War. In the 1970s and 80s, Kennan became a leader of those urging negotiations to stop the atomic arms race. So here's a picture of Kennan in these later years. Although Kennan had predicted that containment could break up Soviet power, he was not thrilled when that prediction came true in 1989-91. Instead, he worried that the Russian Empire would devolve into chaos and that American triumphalists would press their advantage. In 1997, he deplored the expansion of NATO right up to the Soviet border as the greatest mistake of the entire post-Cold War period. So here's Kennan at age 93 in 1997. Even at age 93, he did not abandon his ambition to influence events, his passion for Russia, or his penchant for emotional self-dramatization. After trying to convince the Clinton administration to reverse course, he resigned himself to defeat. He wrote in his diary, "In the colossal blunder of NATO expansion, I saw the final failure of the effort to which I have given so large a portion of my life, the effort to find a reasonable area of understanding and sympathy between the great Russian people and our own." And then he wrote, "But how old I am, how weak, how helpless." So here was Kennan, to the end of his days, the passionate strategist, thinking he really could make a difference in American foreign policy. But it was also, to the end of his days, the grown-up boy from that unhappy family living in that dark house on Cambridge Avenue. So I want to conclude my talk with a few minutes from two Milwaukee excerpts from his diary, one relating to his mother and the other relating to his father. First, we'll turn to his mother again. So this excerpt is from written in Milwaukee in July 1955. Kennan was 51, and he was visiting his sister, who lived, of course, in Milwaukee. On our way into town, we passed the Forest Home Cemetery and stopped off here to see the Kennan graves. We didn't know where they were, but at one point we all sensed the nearness of them. I got out of the car and walked, dazed and excited, among the headstones, a little panicky, like a lost child. "Father, Father, where are you?" It was as though if I did not find the grave, we'd be forever lost and separated. Then he finds the graves. First my mother, Florence James Kennan, whom I never knew, struck down by death only a month after the birth of the fourth of her children. Here, buried and helpless, all the love that could not be expended, all the tenderness that could not be bestowed. Dear mother, it must have been hard and bitter to leave your little children. We have all held you in a sort of awed adoration. Our ever young, dead mother, beautiful, unworldly, full only of love and grace for us, like a saint. In imagination we have received all you would have given us. Pity only that we with our youth could not have borne some of your frailty, could not have breathed back into you some of the strength you gave us. May our love somehow or other reach you. Next to her, my father, Kent Kossuth Kennan. And then Kennan wrote, God be praised, they do lie side by side. In other words, Kent was not buried with his stepmother. This was a real marriage, full of difficulty, embarrassment, and pain. Family differences, differing social origins, and whatnot, but full of real love and total mutual commitment. And then he goes on. His father. This February 1965. February 1965, Kennan was 61 years old. He took the train to Milwaukee. He visited his relatives, and he then went on and gave a lecture at Ripon College. And this is the evening after he gave the lecture. I was assigned to a guest apartment. It is, I learned, the one in which my father lived in his senior year. I darkened the rooms and sat by the window, watching the storm. It's wintertime. Watching the storm and the night scene. White and deserted now under the streetlights. The black, bare tree trunks swaying slightly as they reached up past the window and disappeared into the gloom above. And everywhere the clouds of blowing snow. The blessed snow that everyone professes these days so to dislike. Sweeping, drifting, cleansing, it covered everything, mercifully and impartially, with its shroud of momentary purity. Staring thus out into the night, I was suddenly struck with a surge of feeling for my long dead father. This shy and lonely man, this misplaced aesthete, struggling to bestow the imprint of true spiritual distinction and elegance on the shabby, stuffy, claustrophobic existence of the house on Cambridge Avenue. A man whom almost no one understood and whom I myself came to understand properly only after he was gone. I thought of his one-time presence in this place, of our respective lonelinesses. I wondered suddenly whether we were not at that moment very close. He must surely have stood on just such a night on just such a night at one of these windows in his shabby farm boy clothes, and looked out at the storm as I was now doing. His wonder of what lay further afield in the night could scarcely have been greater for all his youth than the questioning I now felt for all my wanderings and experience. Were these chasms of time and death real ones? Was there not a unity and a fellowship in the sensing, the living of this moment? Was this not the tapping of his hands, a la Wuthering Heights, that I heard in the dry crackling of the snow against the window? And so the silly dialogue formed itself and rattled away in my mind through the unslept hours, like the notes of some little idiotic song that goes unwanted through your head. Father, Father, have I done right to come all this way to make myself close to you through these scenes of your youth? Or was this an act of maudlin sentimentality? There's so much I could have given you and didn't. Does this help? Soft, soft, my son. You should know better than to provoke these mysteries. The moment is indeed the same as you suspect. This is the same snowfall. The 90 intervening summers are as nothing. Beyond that is not given to you to know. Do what your deeper nature tells you to do. Give it, if you can, a break in the face of all the dust and rubbish of life. And meanwhile, take comfort in the beauty of the storm and the night. See the strength and indifference of the snow, for it falls upon all. Sense its lesson, and if you feel a nearness, then know that it is true. Your own sense of time and space is of no consequence. For the sort of nearness you long for the sort of nearness you long for, there is no theater anywhere or at any time other than in the soul. Unquote. I just have a few lines here. It is at once a banal and a significant aspect of the human condition that all of us, if we live long enough, become orphans. George F. Kennan, however, became a near orphan only 2 months after he was born. The consequences of that loss reverberated through his life from Cambridge Avenue to Containment and beyond. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Want to ask any questions? This is time for some questions on Frank's talk.
Yeah.
I was surprised to hear of his breakdown in his institutionalization in the sanitarium.
Well, yeah,
Is that what
I
you
could talk about that.
today, a nervous breakdown? Or?
Well, it was both a physical and mental breakdown. And he had several of them in his life. I mean, he would also, when things got tense, he would check into a hospital. I mean, and I said it was he had a medical doctor and it was a medical facility. But the doctor was also Freudian, very Freudian. Actually, she became his family doctor for the rest of her life. She was a Hungarian Jew whom he later helped emigrate to the United States. He remained the Kennan family doctor into the 1980s. But it was both, I mean, it was both a mental and physical breakdown. I mean, so I could talk more about it, but that's what it was.
And I'm surprised that kind of in the prime of his career, he has this health issue, whatever you want to call it, and then he sort of goes back to the State Department.
Right, and the
he
State
uses his career as a diplomat.
Right, I mean, the State Department, I mean, this is at a time, in 1934-35, the State Department, when Franklin Roosevelt became president, as an economy measure, they were expanding works progress and stuff like that, but they also cut government salaries by 15%, right? So this is a time of economy. But the ambassador, Bullitt, thought so highly of Kennan that he urged the State Department to grant Kennan months of, actually not even sick leave, because he was technically posted to the American legation in Vienna. And he stayed in this hospital for 3 or 4 months, and then he worked in the legation for several months and didn't go back to Moscow until November 1935. So Kennan was there with the full knowledge and support, financial support of the State Department, and didn't even count against his sick leave time. One of the aspects is Kennan was brilliant. He was an incredibly hard worker, and people in the State Department appreciated him. He felt he should be even more appreciated, but he rose faster at the State Department than anybody of his cohort in the Foreign Service. Yeah, Michael?
I want to ask, to some extent, all of us who traveled overseas or lived overseas for a good amount of time, sometimes you go through that kind of syndrome where you fall in love with the place you were at that's so different from your own home. And you kind of have a tendency to romanticize. I think I went through that when I traveled to Latin America. But it seems to me, what you were saying, I'm asking you, what you're saying about Kennan runs much deeper. It has its roots in his older relatives and it's a much more intense. I'm sure a lot of State Department people go through some of this.
Right. The unflattering term is going native. And that thing. Right. But Kennan also, I mean, he loved Hamburg, Germany, interwar Hamburg, Germany. He spent a lot of time in Germany, but it's with Russia that he felt that the deepest connection. It's difficult to explain. I think we can try to explain some of it, but and what to me is striking here. I mean, kind of a bottom line is here's a guy who's one of the prime strategists during the Cold War, and his emotional feelings for Russia keep on seeping through his policy recommendations. I mean, in February '48, when he calls for negotiations with the Russians, there's no one even thinking about that, and yet this is what he thinks it. And it means enough to him, and he thinks that it's enough of a presence in his mind that he's going to, in effect, sacrifice his standing or his credibility with the Truman administration by advocating this. Yeah.
Seems like a tortured soul, really, throughout most of his life.
Yeah,
and
I think it's probably true.
And particularly, he's got this incredible love for Russia, and it seems it leads him to leave the State Department at least due to his conflict with other colleagues. And so when we get to the Nixon administration in particular, we have containment on steroids. It's containment with realpolitik and almost. So is that reflected in his journals at all, kind of his disdain over what's going on? I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
did he predict anything like that could come out of this theory of containment?
Did he predict what? That relations would worsen?
Well, that you would have kind of this, certainly what we get with Nixon, you know, the support of dictatorships in Latin America with Pinochet.
But it's also détente. I mean, Nixon goes to Moscow and, you know, and becomes friends with Brezhnev. I mean, there's friends, so to speak. You know, the Nixon administration really reaches out to the Soviet Union in a way that previous administrations had not done.
Yeah. But there seems to be this disconnect, though, at least in, I mean, certainly with Nixon and his outward displays towards the Soviet Union and the covert actions. Is there...
Well, that's actually of a piece. I mean, Kennan felt that he would have more, excuse me, Nixon felt that this, you're more your avenue, Michael, but Nixon felt he would have greater credibility with the Kremlin if he could show them that he was keeping his hemisphere in line by beating up on Allende. You know, that's not really a contradiction. That's a way of showing that you're man enough to deal with the opposing superpower by taking care of these obstreperous Latin Americans. But Kennan, I think, you know, Kennan leaves government because, like you said, he increasingly diverges from the viewpoint of people, whether it's Truman or later the Eisenhower administration. But it's also that Kennan wanted to be in a position of authority. I mean, Kennan thought that he should be Secretary of State, and he wasn't willing to settle for a position where he was not going to be able to have a lot of influence. Other questions? Yeah.
Thinking about when he starts keeping the diary in 1915 or so, or
1916. It's January 1st, 1916.
Thinking about the political climate of Milwaukee at that time, and kind of the socialist tendency starting in about 1910. Does in his writings and his desire for this kind of communal living or this harmonious living, does he write at all or reflect kind of Milwaukee politics or society? No. I mean, it's kind of, you know, little boy stuff. Sure. Little boy stuff, who's playing with and so forth and that kind of. No, and the diary is actually that diary is it's very kind of light in tone. So he really does. The only thing of any kind of political implication is that he's excited about the preparedness campaign, and this is going on. And one of the things he likes to do after school is to go see where people are drilling here and there, and you know, he's thinking about joining the Navy, and so that's happening at that point. When Woodrow Wilson comes to visit Milwaukee, Kennan's running around trying to catch a glimpse of him, and finally does. Yeah.
In 1933, when he got to Moscow, that was right at the end of the first 5-year plan, and that had already devastating effects on Russia. Is there any evidence in his diary that he was aware of those things? This was, I think, after Stalin's giddy with success speech already, wasn't it?
Yeah, right. You know, Kennan coined the term the romance of economic development. And like a fair number of other Americans, there was the idea, well, you know, the Russian people are kind of slovenly, they're lazy, and you need, a certain amount of discipline is necessary, not extreme, but a certain amount of discipline is necessary if you're going to have really change Russian society and modernize it, industrialize it, and so forth. So in terms of, I don't think Kennan knew what was going on in terms of the collectivization of agriculture and the famine, in Ukraine and so forth. But in terms of the industrialization, he was kind of in tune with that, and that's what I said, that he engaged with younger party officials, and he thought overall what the Russians were doing was good for Russia. He didn't think it was really appropriate for other countries, but it was appropriate for Russia given the nature of the Russian people, whom he idealized, but he also primitivized them. You know, they were kind of like, in a way, like noble savages in a sense, and they needed strict discipline if you were going to get any place.
Got another question too.
Yeah.
This is a kind of a minor thing. when he went to Vienna, did he check into the General Hospital or did he check into the Nerv- and Heilanstalt up in Steinhof?
Neither. It was a sanitarium Gutenbrunn. It was a little bit outside of Vienna. And it was, you know, he was not psychoanalyzed, but it was like rest, above all rest and time away from Russia. That is what was prescribed. Yeah, Mike.
One quick thing, I just wanted you to, it was very striking when you talked to the graduate students earlier this morning. If you could maybe touch upon, it's going a little off field, but Kennan's predictions about the Ukraine, how the United States should, what U.S. policy towards the Ukraine and Russia should be.
Right,
Very telling today.
Yeah, I mentioned here that Kennan was very much against the expansion of NATO to include Poland and Czech Republic and certainly the Baltics. But what I mentioned this morning is it was striking, I think, and that was in 1948, the height of the Cold War, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, who was one of the leading hawks, Forrestal asked Kennan, okay, as head of the policy planning staff, if we beat Russia in a war, Russia's defeated after military war, we beat Russia in a war, what should our war aims be in terms of Russian territory? What do we want to break up? What do we want to, you know, what do we want? So, you know, the ideal American situation. So what do we want? So Kennan said, well, probably the Baltics will become independent. They have this long tradition and so forth. But then he goes on for about a page, and he says, it would be a mistake for us to allow or to encourage the separation of Ukraine from Russia. He said that Ukraine is to Russia as the American Midwest is to the United States. That the economic ties, the cultural ties, the political long-term historic ties are so strong that the Russians would never accept long-term separation or permanent separation of Ukraine from the rest of Russia. So, I mean, that's striking. I mean, of course, this is now 60 years later and so forth and so on. But, you know, in general, Kennan thought that American behavior after the end of the Cold War was too much like Allied behavior after World War I, that the Americans were not looking, and the Western Europeans were not looking long range enough to realize that the Russians would revive at least some of their power, and if they were highly unhappy, highly discontented, it would not lead to a stable situation.
Any more questions? Well, I would encourage people to, we're going to have refreshments out here in the hall, and to you talk to Frank and ask him some other questions you might have personally when we get out there. And thanks again, Frank.